Okay, folks. I'm going to start off here. This is just a session that I want to do on the game's design process. And this is, I suppose, just a step-by-step, I suppose, guide to what it is you've been doing in terms of your game design, but maybe to put a little bit of structure on it. You might wonder why I didn't do this at the very beginning, but there's a sense sometimes that it's probably better to go through the process and then maybe reflect on the steps that you took. Okay, so really, so that the idea, it's like any project. The design of a game is like any project, and there's a process. And the process is really, um, it begins with, I suppose, an initial idea for the game. And if you think back on all of you and how you started your game's design, the idea has more or less remained, the core idea has more or less remained throughout your development of your games. So there's the idea and there's the process. The idea is the concept, the core of the game, and then the process is maybe a sense to some extent as to how it's going to be played. So you come up with that idea, and then in some way you write it down, you formalize it. And then what you have to do is to test it against the goals that you want the game to achieve. You evaluate, and then you change it and test it again, you evaluate it again, you test it again, you evaluate it again. And that's sort of like an iterative process. So that's really how I suppose the game design process works. And I suppose the type of elements of the process is that, you know, a lot of the early work, whether you do it formally using a flip chart sheet or as he did to do it in group discussion, is around brainstorming, coming up with ideas. And then you try to create a physical prototype. And that physical prototype then is played with people, and it's presented to people as an idea for a game. And you can move on to software prototype if you're going to move into a digital game, which most of you won't, I imagine, but if you were going to, you'd move on. And then what you do is you put together design documentation. That's really the rules of the game. It's how it's played. It's where you see it, the objectives of the game, where you see the game going. And then you produce the game, and then you just make sure that it is properly, it works when it's being played. So, I mean, it sounds reasonably straightforward, but as you know, it's a lot more complicated than that when you try to get down to it. Okay. So if you look at a game and where you're starting with a game, one of the first things is you need to get a sense of what role the player is going to take. And that can be, you know, I mean, it sounds very straightforward, but in some way, is it going to be a team challenge? Is it going to be individual players? Are the players going to move through the board, or are they going to direct pieces through the board? So what is the role of the player in the game? So I suppose if you look at, say, something like Monopoly, the role of the player is to um, manage a portfolio of properties, and they manage that by moving around the board. So that's one type of role that a player might have. A very different role would be something like Snakes and Ladders, where the role is to get to the very, it's to move along the board, and in doing so you get to the end, and all you have to do in order to be able to achieve that is to roll a dice. So that is linked then to the role and the goal. So what is the goal for the player? To win the game, to get to the end, to exclude every other player? And what are the obstacles that they're going to meet along the way to achieve that goal? What do they need then by way of resources to help them accomplish the game or the goal? And where is the conflict in your game? Now, I mean, people in this space might say, oh God, I don't want conflict in my game. But conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. There needs to be a tension there needs to be things hindering you from achieving your goal. Otherwise, it's a very simple game. If you had snakes and ladders and you excluded the snakes and only had ladders, then it's not maybe as fun as having snakes and ladders. So the conflict relates to, I suppose, the things that set you back in the game or the obstacles that you have to overcome. Okay. The other thing about the conflict in the game, and again, we'll take snakes and ladders as a good example, is that the conflict between players happens in the basis that the first one to the end wins. Everybody doesn't, I mean, you could create snakes and ladders where everybody gets to the end wins, but the conflict happens because it's a race. The first one to the end wins. You may also have conflict in a snakes and ladders game on the basis that two players can or maybe cannot be on the same space at the same time. So you could have build conflict into a game of snakes and ladders like that. Then you need to move to, okay, what are the rules? How do you govern the playing of the game? And how do you manage that conflict, those obstacles? How do you manage the process by which people advance in the game? So what are the actions that the players have to take, and on what basis do they take those actions? So is it in turns? So like most games are in turns, but there are other games where people play simultaneously. So, sports games, obviously, most sports games are played simultaneously. Two teams play at the same time, and whoever gets to the end wins. There is no reason why you couldn't play something like Snakes and Ladders simultaneously. But we tend to play it to avoid confusion in turns. So how many players can play? You need to get a sense whether that's important or the extent to which it's important. And who are you aiming the game at? What are the age group? What are the profile of those that you're aiming? And I suppose the final sort of question is, do you have a sort of a platform, a preference? So do you want to use a board game? Do you want to use a computer game? Do you want to use a particular type of computer game? Do you want to use it on microbits? Do you want to use it on Scratch? Do you want to use card game? Do you want a role play game? So you decide what format you want the game in, and that can be a very sort of decisive part of the game. You can also be quite specific in terms of you want to race to the end game, or you want a strategy game, or you want another type of dynamic within the game. Okay. So once you have a sense of those things, you need to figure out how you define each player's goals. So what is it that the player has to do in order to get to win the game, or to accomplish their even their turn? So what do they need to do to win? And what is the most important single action that a player needs to conduct within the game? Okay, so what we mean by that is in Snakes and Ladders, it's rolling a dice. In Monopoly, it's not rolling the dice. The dice is important, but the most important thing is the purchase of property. And that's the single most, like, dice is an important part of Monopoly, but the dice enables you to do the main function of the game, which is to purchase property. And based on your purchases, your strategic purchases of property, you beat the other players. So you need to figure out how that works. How is it that you complete and achieve the action of the game? And what is the process by which you purchase property or you purchase hotels? So what are the rules that enable you to complete that important action within the game? Okay. When you've considered that, what you need to start doing is building a prototype for your game, and that's the most important thing. Part of the process is building the prototype. The vast majority of prototypes never go beyond prototypes. So, but once it's a prototype, it's a game. It may never move beyond that, but it's still a game. Okay, so there needs to be a good prototype, and this is the case whether it's for board games or for digital games. And what you need to check when you're doing the prototype is, are people other than yourself interested in playing the game? So do the mechanics of the game work in terms of people's interest? So they might interest you, they might interest the other people who developed the game, but do they interest people who weren't involved in making the game? Do they understand it, and are they engaged by it? And what you can do is it allows you to focus, in your prototype on each of the game elements. So how people take turns, does that work? How people purchase property, does that work? How people exchange money, does that work? So each of the different bits in turn you can observe to see how they work, and do they fit together to make an overall experience in the game. Okay, so what you need to do when you're playtesting in the first is isolate the core gameplay mechanics and the actions that a player repeats most often while trying to achieve the goals. Okay, so in Monopoly, it's buying and improving properties with the goal of charging rent. That's the core mechanic. In Super Mario, it's running and avoiding obstacles and gathering treasure. That's the core mechanic. In your games, it might be securing trees, or it might be completing a journey, or it might be creating a path across the countryside. So you need to get a sense of what that core mechanic is. Okay, so what you need to think about then, like, to a large extent, that is, I suppose, the basis of creating a prototype of a game that is going to work for you as a game. So what you need to do then is you need to go through a process of say on the right there, you go through a process of fixing it. So the process is, you have your model or your prototype, you play it, you amend the rules insofar as they need to be amended, to get the game moving. And then you take feedback from people and you create another model. So you go around in that loop. So, it's like a sort of a traditional sort of a race. There's cycles within every game. So if you look at Snakes and Ladders, there's only one cycle in Snakes and Ladders, so you get to the end and that's the end of it, right? But you could create a Snakes and Ladders game where you have different cycles. So the first cycle is 20 sort of pieces on snakes, 20 boxes on Snakes and Ladders, and whoever gets that, they win cycle 2. And you engage a different dynamic, and then you've the next cycle is cycle 2, and a different person might win cycle 2 and another person might win cycle 3. So you can do that, and you need to do that, so you can have games, levels or cycles in the game, and that's one way of and like a turn, sort of a cycle of turns can be a cycle in a game. Okay, so when you're looking at how players are playing the game, they need to have a concept of your game in their head. Did they have the right mental model? Do they know what they need to do? Do they understand the story of the game? Do they understand the rules of the game? So they need to know what it is they have to do. Roll the dice, move the places. That's good. They need to roll the dice, move the players, or move the pieces. So they need to know all of the actions that they have to do within the game. They need to know the rules that govern those actions. The other thing is they need to know how the feedback works. So when we say that the feedback in a game, what it means is they need to know whether what they've done in the game has move them forward or move them backwards? You know, have they actually progressed within the game? In some games, that's very, very straightforward. Very straightforward in terms of moving from 1 to 100. You're at 70, you're doing better than the person's at 50. But in other games, it might be more subtle in that you might have people in a Monopoly game with very little money but a lot of property. And they need to get a sense as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And then what you need to do is you need to make sure as the game progresses and you know what, that the loop of the game, so the rules of the game work as well at the end of the game as they do at the beginning of the game. Okay, so sometimes that's they work differently. In Monopoly, the dice is the roll of the dice is important. You want to get lots of land and lots of properties at the beginning of the game. At the end of the game, you're not so keen on land and on properties. Whereas Snakes and Ladders, the loop is the same whether it's the beginning or the end. Okay, so you need to be sure that the rules governing the game and the process of the game works at each phase of the game and doesn't change too much. Okay, so in Mario, the skills that you develop as you go through the game get more complicated as you continue through the game. So, but the basic skills are the same at the beginning as they are at the end. Okay, so if you want to, at a more advanced level, when you're looking at the prototype of your game, you need to have this playable prototype. You know, you have it drawn out. Most of you have it. And you need the core rules of the game to be as simple as possible. Don't overcomplicate it. You need to be able to explain your game in a really good, fast, easy way. So you can then say the formal details. So you add the rules and the procedures. So you make your prototype a fully functioning game. So is the way the player engages with the game, is it the best choice? Are the rules and procedures correct? So what we mean, the player interaction structure, what that means is that is the dice the best way to move people around the board, or might a swirling top be better, or might putting your hand into a bag and picking out a number, is a 6-headed dice the best, or maybe a 10-headed dice might be better, 12, 18, 20 heads of a dice. So is there a different sort of, do you need to look at how that happens? Or maybe you might decide that, you know what, this game lends itself better to a card game than a board game. You might realize towards at this stage, but you know, so you need to make those decisions about the formal details. So the structure then is add structure to your core mechanics. So it might be that you can say how you buy property and Monopoly. You might need to refine that as a process, or how you secure a particular part of the game. You might need to refine that. And you need to create a story around those to make the game more interesting. And you might create points or leaderboard in some way that again keeps people interesting. Okay, and then the refinement. Is your game fun and compelling? If it's not, what might you add to it? And to make it fun and compelling. And then what you do is you design, you test, you analyze, and you design again. So really, I suppose in some way, this is, I suppose, a summary of the whole process that you need to go through in terms of games testing. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. Yeah, thanks a million. And look, we'll chat again next week. Talk to you. Bye.